Walk into any grocery store beer aisle and you can feel how easy this category makes the decision for you. The Cold Mountain graphics say refreshment. The slim can says discipline. The imported bottle says quality. The Old World crest says heritage. The cloudy wheat beer with the orange slice says craft. And that is exactly why this conversation matters, because beer is one of the most branding-driven products in the entire store. A lot of people are not really choosing a liquid, they are choosing a signal. A signal that says simple, active, premium, classic, European, smooth, special. But once you stop reading the front of the package like a promise and start reading the whole product like a shopper trying to get real value, some of the most familiar names on the shelf start looking a lot less convincing. This is not about pretending every popular beer is secretly toxic, or acting like a mass-market lager is some kind of scandal. It is much simpler than that. It is about whether the image matches the substance, whether the price matches the experience, whether the beer is being sold on flavor, brewing identity, and clarity, or on temperature cues, lifestyle cues, ritual cues, and decades of repetition. Because a lot of these brands are not necessarily surviving because they are the most honest or distinctive choices. They are surviving because they are familiar, heavily promoted, and socially frictionless. People know the logo, they know the can, they know what ordering it says about them. That is not the same thing as making the smartest choice. So if you want beer that feels more transparent, more grounded, or simply more worth your money, here are 8 brands you may want to think twice about, and then 4 better alternatives that make a lot more sense once you stop buying the story on the front and start buying with your eyes open. Start with Michelob Ultra, because few beer brands sell a feeling more aggressively than this one. The front-facing message is not really about beer at all. It is about restraint, self-control, clean living, golf course sunlight, gym-adjacent respectability, the idea that you are making the adult, disciplined choice. The can is sleek, the language is light, and everything about it quietly nudges you toward one conclusion. This is the smarter beer. But when a beer is marketed more like a lifestyle accessory than a beverage with a point of view, that should already make you pause. What the branding suggests is precision. What the actual buying logic suggests is compromise being sold as aspiration. This is beer stripped down so far that the absence of character becomes the product. And if that is exactly what you want, fine. But a lot of people are not really choosing it because they love what it brings to the glass. They are choosing it because the packaging lets them feel like they are not making a bad decision. That is a very different kind of purchase. It is not beer first. It is self-image first. And here is the trust gap. In most food categories, if something wants credit for being the cleaner, more intentional option, shoppers expect more clarity, not less. They expect a stronger reason to believe. With Michelob Ultra, the impression of discipline is often doing more work than the beer itself. The sip is usually extremely soft, extremely restrained, almost designed to disappear as soon as it lands. There is nothing mysterious about why it sells. It is easy, it is familiar, and it allows people to participate without feeling indulgent. But if you are paying a premium for a product whose main achievement is making itself as non-disruptive as possible, you are not really rewarding brewing distinction. You are rewarding image management. And that is a recurring pattern in this category. Then there is Coors Light, a beer that may be one of the clearest examples of packaging carrying the entire emotional load. The label does not just sell beer, it sells cold, mountains, silver, blue activation, frost. The whole brand identity is built around a physical sensation rather than a flavor identity, and that should tell you something immediately. When the most memorable thing about a beer is the temperature theater built around it, you have to ask what is being elevated and what is being covered. The front of the can tells you this is the ultimate refreshment beer. The colder it gets, the more the packaging validates your decision. But extreme cold is one of the easiest ways to flatten perception. It mutes aroma, it softens nuance. It lets a very neutral beer feel even more frictionless. Again, if your goal is maximum lightness and minimum challenge, that is your call. But if the brand's biggest promise is basically, don't worry, this will barely register, then the label is not really guiding you toward quality. It is guiding you toward absence. Pause on that for a second, because this is where the category starts showing its hand. A lot of beer labels do not persuade you by explaining what makes the beer distinctive. They persuade you by lowering the stakes of buying it. Cold enough, easy enough, familiar enough, socially safe enough. Coors Light is brilliant at that. But brilliance in marketing is not the same thing as value in the glass. Strip away the mountain imagery, the silver blue chill cues, the whole refrigerator-ready identity, and what are you left with? For many shoppers, not much they would passionately defend on taste alone. That does not make it evil. It makes it over-supported by branding. Bud Light lands in a different way, because its label is not trying to be athletic or icy or imported. It is trying to be normal, dependable, unquestioned. This is the beer equivalent of background music that everybody knows so well they stop hearing it. The label suggests social ease, cookouts, stadiums, a brand so embedded in routine that buying it feels less like a decision and more like muscle memory. And that kind of familiarity can be powerful enough to hide almost every other question a shopper should be asking. Because once a brand becomes the default, people stop evaluating it like a product. They evaluate it like a social tool. Will people recognize it? Yes. Will it cause disagreement? Probably not. Will it offend anyone's expectations? No. But that still leaves the bigger issue untouched. Does it actually give you a compelling reason to choose it beyond that? Bud Light often benefits from being the beer people know how to not think about. And in grocery terms, that is a massive advantage. But it is not the same as having a strong case on flavor, texture, or identity. This is one of the most important distinctions in the entire aisle. Popularity can create a false sense of proof. We assume the product must be getting something deeply right because it is everywhere. But in shelf-driven categories, availability and habit often do most of the heavy lifting. Bud Light's real strength is not that it delivers a vivid beer experience. Its strength is that it asks almost nothing from the buyer and promises almost nothing risky in return. That is convenient. It is also a remarkably low bar. If you are the kind of shopper trying to become more deliberate, that should matter. A product being easy to agree on is not the same thing as a product being worth seeking out. Miller Lite is a more interesting case, because its front-facing story sounds a little more substantive. It carries the heritage angle, the classic light beer angle, the old, more taste positioning that suggests a better balance, a smarter middle ground, something with a bit more backbone than the thinnest options, but still easy enough for everyday drinking. On paper, that sounds more convincing than pure cold theater marketing. And to be fair, this is where a lot of shoppers convince themselves they have escaped the light beer trap without really leaving the same logic behind. What the label suggests is that you are getting a more satisfying version of the category. What the aisle often suggests is that you are still buying a heavily optimized compromise, just wrapped in a slightly more reassuring story. This is what a lot of legacy brands do extremely well. They do not need to reinvent the shelf identity. They just need to look seasoned enough that you assume the product has earned its place. Miller Lite carries that old-school credibility. But credibility borrowed from decades of presence is not identical to present-day distinction. And the more you pay attention, the more the framing becomes clear. The beer is not being sold as an expression of raw ingredient character or style specificity. It is being sold as a stable middle lane. Familiar, manageable, slightly more beer-like than the most neutral light lagers, but still built for maximum broad appeal. In other words, the front tells you you are getting more. The experience often tells you you are getting a little more, but still within a very controlled, very safe, very mass-calculated boundary. If you genuinely love it, fine. But if you buy it because the label makes it feel like the grown-up, more legitimate light option, you may be reacting more to the category positioning than the actual difference. Now shift to Corona Extra, because this is where packaging and ritual become impossible to ignore. The label suggests import authenticity, sunshine, beach escape, a kind of casual premium simplicity. Clear bottle, pale gold liquid, lime ritual. The whole experience is visual before it is sensory. Before you even taste it, the brand has already built a postcard in your head, and for a lot of shoppers, that postcard is the product. But here is where front label confidence runs into physical reality. Clear bottles are beautiful on a shelf. They are also less protective. Beer is a product that does not always benefit from being displayed like perfume. That bright, transparent look can sell freshness while creating a weaker shield from the very thing that can compromise beer more quickly. And what happens culturally? The lime becomes part of the routine. The garnish becomes normal. The add-on becomes inseparable from the identity. That should raise a question most people never ask. Are you enjoying the beer itself, or are you enjoying the full branded ritual wrapped around it? This is not an attack on anyone who likes Corona. It is a challenge to the logic of what you are paying for. The front of the bottle suggests uncomplicated authenticity. The actual buying experience often suggests a premium charged for image, setting, and social memory. In a blind conversation stripped of beach associations, vacation ads, and the lime wedge, would this still feel like a standout purchase? For some people, maybe. For a lot of others, the answer gets much murkier very quickly. And that is exactly the point. When a product needs the surrounding script as much as the liquid itself, shoppers should at least recognize that they are buying a performance as much as a beer. Heineken takes the imported premium illusion in a different direction. Where Corona leans sunlight and ritual, Heineken leans polish. Green bottle. European confidence. Clean red star. The label suggests a sharper kind of global legitimacy. The beer you reach for when you want something that feels more international than domestic macro but still familiar enough to find anywhere. It sells the idea of stepping up without stepping too far away from the mainstream. That is a very lucrative position. But once again, the label is often doing more storytelling than the beer is doing explaining. Imported status can be real, but imported does not automatically mean more compelling, more careful, or more worth the price. A lot of shoppers still treat the wordless signals of a European bottle as if they are proof of higher standards. Sometimes that is true. Sometimes it is just shelf theater with an accent. Heineken often benefits from that exact assumption. It looks like a move up. It feels like a move up. It orders like a move up. Whether it drinks like one is a different question. And there is a reason this brand tends to produce such split reactions. When a beer is genuinely loved for its character, that character usually becomes the centerpiece. With Heineken, the conversation is often just as much about identity as taste. The green bottle, the global image, the certainty of the brand, that tells you something. The front of the label suggests sophistication. The actual decision may be closer to paying for globally recognized status and a reliable imported script. If the product were presented without those visual cues, in a plain can, at the same price, would the appeal hold steady? That is the test more shoppers should run in their heads. Stella Artois may be one of the cleanest examples of premium signaling working overtime. The label tells a very elegant story. Heritage, European tradition, refined lager, distinctive chalice service, restaurant familiarity. The brand has been positioned for years as the beer for people who want to feel like they have chosen something a little more elevated than the standard domestic options without entering a truly niche or demanding territory. It is premium in the safest possible way, accessible sophistication, and that combination sells. But this is exactly where a shopper can get overcharged by atmosphere, because premium packaging, premium glassware, premium pronunciation, and premium cues do not automatically create a premium drinking experience. Stella often occupies that middle zone where the presentation says, "Upgrade," louder than the product itself. It is not obscure enough to feel discovered. It is not transparent enough to feel especially revealing. It is simply very good at wearing the costume of a step up. That may sound harsh, but it matters. There is a difference between paying for better beer and paying for better framing. This is where the label versus reality gap becomes almost textbook. The front suggests old-world distinction. The actual shelf roll suggests highly scalable premiumization. In other words, a globally familiar lager that uses design, history cues, and serving ritual to justify a level of esteem many buyers never stop to interrogate. If you love the flavor, fair enough. But a lot of people are not buying Stella because they have carefully compared it against a wide range of lagers and concluded it is the most rewarding. They are buying it because the bottle and the reputation perform sophistication for them. That is a packaging victory. It is not always a consumer victory. Now we get to Blue Moon, and this is where the conversation becomes more revealing than people expect. Because Blue Moon is not sold like a standard macro lager. It is sold like discovery. The label suggests craft-adjacent charm. Belgian-style intrigue, a softer, more flavorful escape from the generic domestic lane. The cloudy pour, the wheat beer identity, the orange slice ritual, the slightly more artisanal look on the shelf, all of it tells the buyer the same thing. This is more thoughtful, more curated, more interesting. And for a lot of casual shoppers, that is enough. But this is also where branding becomes incredibly effective at manufacturing a sense of boutique distinction inside a mass-market environment. Blue Moon's biggest strength may not be that it is the most expressive version of its style. Its biggest strength may be that it introduces people to the idea of style without really forcing them to question the larger machine around it. It lets buyers feel like they have left the generic aisle even when they are still operating inside a heavily managed, broad appeal framework. That matters because a lot of people confuse a more decorative flavor profile with actual transparency or depth. Pause here, because this is one of the biggest misconceptions in the entire beer category. Slightly more flavor is not the same thing as stronger product honesty. A fruit garnish ritual is not the same thing as a clearer brewing story. A cloudy pour is not the same thing as craft integrity. Blue Moon can absolutely be enjoyable. That is not the issue. The issue is whether the label encourages buyers to overestimate how special, artisanal, or revealing the product really is. For many shoppers, it does. The orange slice has almost become part of the brand's proof, which is fascinating when you think about it. When a product's cultural serving habit becomes part of what makes it feel premium, you are no longer evaluating just the beer. You are evaluating the staged experience attached to it. And that brings us to the last brand, Budweiser. Because if Bud Light is the default social lubricant, Budweiser is the default legacy story. The label suggests tradition, national familiarity, old-school brewing confidence, the red and gold certainty of a brand that expects respect just for having been around so long. It presents itself like a standard bearer, the classic, the one you are supposed to recognize as inherently legitimate because it has occupied space in the culture for generations. But heritage can become a kind of shortcut, and shoppers should be careful with shortcuts. The front of the package tells you this is an iconic beer with weight behind it. The reality many buyers experience is a product whose biggest asset is not that it still feels revelatory, but that it still feels known. That difference is everything. A legacy brand can coast on symbolic value for a very long time. People inherit trust in it before they ever evaluate it for themselves. It becomes the beer people picture when they hear the word beer. And once a product reaches that level of mental saturation, it no longer has to prove itself the same way newer, smaller, or less culturally protected products do. This is where the entire category almost loops back on itself. The label says classic, the shelf logic says entrenched. The buyer often reads that as earned superiority when it may simply be the power of repetition. Budweiser is not necessarily the worst beer on this list in a technical sense, but it may be one of the clearest examples of how brand gravity can replace fresh evaluation. And if you have been buying a label for years, mostly because it feels like the safe definition of beer, that is exactly the kind of habit worth challenging. So what should you buy instead if you want options that feel more honest, more distinctive, or just more worth thinking about? Start with Pilsner Urquell. If what you actually want is a crisp, drinkable lager with a real sense of identity, this is the kind of alternative that immediately exposes how many pseudo-premium lagers are leaning on aesthetics more than substance. The label is not trying to sell you a lifestyle transformation. It is selling a style, a known flavor direction, a beer that still feels clean and refreshing, but not hollow. It gives you a much better example of what easy to drink can look like when the product still has a point of view. Then look at Sierra Nevada Pale Ale. This is a great reset for anyone who has been trained to think beer has to choose between bland mass appeal and over-the-top intensity. What makes this alternative useful is not just the flavor, it is the honesty of the proposition. The label suggests character, and the beer actually gives you character. Malt, hops, aroma, a real sensory presence. Not chaos, not gimmick, just a clearer relationship between what the brand says it is and what the glass confirms. Even if pale ale is not your forever favorite, trying something like this recalibrates your sense of what a branded beer can be when it is not apologizing for having flavor. If you like the general lane Blue Moon occupies but want a more convincing version of that kind of wheat beer experience, Allagash White is a much stronger place to spend your money. This is where the relief section matters, because good alternatives should not feel like punishment or purity theater. They should feel like clarity. Allagash White gives you the soft texture, the citrus-friendly lift, the approachable spice notes people often think they are choosing when they buy a mainstream Belgian-style wheat beer, but with a stronger sense that the style itself is the point, not just the serving ritual attached to it. And then there is Guinness Draught, which is a useful corrective for anyone who has spent years assuming that easy drinking has to mean pale, watery, and nearly invisible. Guinness gives you something a lot of the ultra-light and legacy domestic options do not: identity without shouting. It looks different, pours differently, feels different in the mouth, and yet remains approachable enough that it resets the entire conversation. A beer can be recognizable, sessionable, widely available, and still feel like it actually brings something distinct to the experience. That is a more valuable lesson than people realize. Now step back and look at the broader pattern, because this was never just about dunking on a few popular labels. The deeper issue is how beer gets sold to ordinary people. The front of the package rarely says, "Here is the real trade-off." It says, "Here is how you should feel holding this." Athletic, cool, imported, elevated, classic, crafty, safe. That is the emotional architecture of the aisle. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. You start noticing that some beers are basically built from temperature messaging. Some are built from social normalcy. Some are built from premium glassware. Some are built from travel fantasy. Some are built from just enough style language to let the buyer feel more sophisticated than they actually had to be. Here is the practical framework that matters more than any individual brand list. The next time you are in the beer aisle, ask 4 simple questions. First, what is this label trying to make me feel before I even know what the beer actually is? If the answer is stronger than the product description, that is a clue. Second, what part of the value is coming from actual beer identity and what part is coming from ceremony? The lime, the icy can, the chalice, the imported glow. Third, if I stripped away the brand's most famous visual cue, would I still believe this is worth the price? And fourth, does this beer tell me something specific and useful about itself, or is it mostly selling confidence through familiarity? That last question is the one that saves people money, because familiarity is expensive, not just in beer, in groceries generally. Once a label becomes part of culture, it can charge for recognition long after the consumer stops getting meaningful extra value. And beer is full of products that survive on exactly that gap. The can says one thing, the shopping logic says another, the bottle suggests prestige. The actual reward is often much thinner than the branding implies. So no, you do not need to become a beer snob. You do not need to pretend every light lager is a betrayal. You do not need to memorize style charts and brewing history before a weekend cookout. But you should stop giving automatic credit to labels that have trained you to confuse image with quality. That is the real takeaway here. If a beer is good for what it is, great, let it earn that honestly. But if what you are mostly paying for is chill cues, legacy cues, imported cues, or fake craft cues, then you are not buying the best version of the category. You are buying a very polished shortcut. And that is why these 8 brands are worth reconsidering. Not because every one of them is undrinkable. Not because everyone who buys them is wrong. but because they represent some of the biggest ways beer branding can outgrow beer substance. And once you notice that, your standards get sharper fast. If you disagree with any of these, good. That usually means you have actually thought about what is in your glass. So drop the beer brand you think gets too much credit, the one you think deserves more respect, and the one sitting in your fridge right now that you suddenly want to reevaluate. And if there is another aisle you want broken down like this, cheap coffee, frozen pizza, bottled water, protein bars, olive oil, whatever it is, say the word, because the front of the package is usually only half the story.